Okay, so may I ask everyone to come back into the plenary so that we can start the afternoon session, please? Please have a seat. And this afternoon we will be actually focusing on how to finance nature-based solutions. And as a start, we will hear from Simon Zadek, who I've met already 20 years ago. Simon Zadek, for those of you who don't know him, he's the chair of Finance for Biodiversity Initiative, and he's also the co-chair of the Technical Committee on the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. He's also director of the Migrant Nation. He has worked with many corporations, governments, and also multi-stakeholder initiatives on their sustainability and broader strategy. And we really look forward today, Simon, to hear from you how finance for biodiversity aims to increase the materiality of biodiversity in financial decision-making, and how also global finance can be aligned with nature conservation and restoration. Welcome, Simon. Hi.
Hi, Barbara. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Can you hear and see me reasonably well?
We can hear and see you very well, yes.
Fantastic. Okay, then I will kick in with no further ado.
Perfect.
Because I know your agenda is very packed, and I will use my time allotted as helpfully as I can.
Very good.
Great. So for those who watched or participated in COP26 in Glasgow, I'm sure we all have many things that we could describe as having taken place, but one of the most marked changes as compared to previous years of negotiations around climate is that the VIP guest was certainly nature. And for the first time, really, we've seen nature having languished in many ways, not just behind the climate agenda, but sort of somewhere in a sort of conservation finance world, we began to see nature kind of edging into the broader conversation of how to align global finance with sustainable development, including climate and nature positive outcomes. In the context of Glasgow, of course, the focus was on nature's role in sequestering carbon and the work that was done and so-called Article 6 that was agreed that will lead to a surge in both compliance and voluntary carbon markets will also lead to significant and growing investments in the purchase of carbon offsets, or if you like, long-term offtake agreements from those who own or steward nature assets. So translating that into common language, you know, somebody doing a deal with, say, a local authority or private owner of land or forest land that is intending to invest in nature in ways that increase the capacity of carbon sequestration. And what they're selling is not the asset, but what they're selling are the rights to own those carbon offsets as they begin to emerge, say, over a 5, 10, or 15-year period. Now that financialization of nature assets, in this case through carbon offset markets, could lead to, in turn, those nature assets and the offtake agreements all being, as is often the case in financial markets, sold on to other folks or securitized and bundled into bonds, placed into capital markets, bought by pension funds, and we'll begin to see what Hank Paulson refers to as nature as a new asset class beginning to emerge at scale. Is this a good thing? Well, not surprisingly, there are very differing views on that subject. There are those that view the huge upside of finding innovative ways to channel investment into a range of different nature positive outcomes as being inherently a good thing, despite weaknesses or shortfalls in the way in which markets work, almost inevitably so, particularly at an early stage. And there are others, of course, both from a right on the sort of purist end, but also across a spectrum, that view with concern the financialization of natural capital into, let's call it, nature assets. Yeah, and so that spectrum has to be recognized and understood. There are reasonable concerns and opportunities lurking all the way along it, and our challenge is to ensure that if we are creating a new generation of nature markets, that we do it in a way that doesn't only deliver private gain, but delivers against our broader objectives, which we can talk about in terms of net zero climate, in terms of nature positive, and more broadly in terms of sustainable development. Now, although in Glasgow, the focus has been on the carbon, climate, nature nexus, as I've just described, clearly nature plays a much broader role in our global economy. And the truth is that every dollar, product, service, and job in our $90 trillion a year global economy, in fact, is entirely dependent on nature. Obviously, parts of the global economy, notably the food system, an $8 trillion slice a year of the global economy, are much more dependent than perhaps other parts of the global economy. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that our global economy simply wouldn't exist if nature's bounty were not available to us. And so it obviously is of some concern that we find that nature is often not deemed material in financing decision-making. And so a number of initiatives are beginning to emerge at scale and rapidly, I'm very pleased to say, to address that. On the risk side, we see the newly established Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. Just to correct, Barbara, one of your earlier observations, I was the co-chair of the early stage technical expert group. Now I'm a senior advisor to the TNFD, now that the new executive director, technical director, and broader secretariat is in place. But TNFD, like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, seeks to build a framework for bringing nature risk, dependencies, and impacts into the strategy, the governance, the financial risk management, and the disclosure of corporates, largely finance-facing, in order to influence the way in which financials, in turn, consider nature-related risks and opportunities, and that feeds through into asset valuation, capital allocation, and costs. So that's a classic move in order to bring nature into the game, much as we have sought to do, particularly in the carbon-related risk space, and more broadly climate over the past 5, 6, 7 years. But the story doesn't stop there. The innovation continues in a number of different spaces, and I wanted just to mention a couple in order for us to, if you like, widen the lens of where innovation for nature in relation to markets is already beginning to emerge, and I think we can expect to emerge much more forcefully over the coming few years. Earlier today, I found myself on a call where the discussion was principally about how a wider range of nature offsets, so not just carbon offsets, is already being developed in some countries at a localized level. The UK being a case in point, one's investing in a particular facility, it has certain environmental downsides. One is forced through regulatory means to make investments that are in effect nature offsets in order to compensate for that damage. Lots of questions about how that can actually take place. And then another conversation as to how blockchain and models of tokenization might be used in order to secure much more liquid and active nature markets with exactly the same sorts of offsets, not just being related to project investment, but being traded on secondary markets and becoming part of a liquid exchange, potentially also cross borders. So broadly, where we're going with carbon markets. Then moving further, yesterday, in fact, I was in discussion with a group that has partnered with the New York Stock Exchange, where they have launched a new platform for IPOs for what they are calling nature asset companies. And these are companies that, in a sense, combine aspects of what we would normally think of for-purpose corporations, so such as B corporations, with particular investment strategies that drive nature positive outcomes linked to a different accounting system that is being developed by the actors that have established this platform in order to demonstrate to investors not only what are the commercial returns, but also what are the nature positive outcomes that they may involve. So that's really in the capital market space and really right in the heartland of what we might think of as capital markets. So, you know, equities, IPOs, and so on. Stepping further across, we all see that there is an emerging market sovereign debt crisis, largely arising as a result of the fiscal downsides and economic downsides of the pandemic. And not surprisingly, there is an active debate in the G20 involving the IMF and others about how that might turn into a new debt relief and restructuring cycle. But for the first time really in history, there is an active discussion about whether this round of debt relief and restructuring might indeed be a green round. What would it mean, for example, if some of the debt relief or restructuring was linked to a new generation of sovereign debt instruments that F4B and others are promoting that are effectively nature and climate KPI linked performance sovereign debt instruments. So in effect, in return for certain nature outcomes, the cost of capital is suitably adjusted. So an iteration or development over and above what we already know well, which are use of proceeds, green bonds. And going even further into the innovation space, you know, there is now work building on the experience that some of you will know of, which is Ant Forest, the app that was developed by Ant Financial Services in China and now has 600 million users receiving through financial transaction platforms information on their carbon footprint and translating that into online identity through the use of social media and gamification. And now a new initiative that F4B is supporting called Every Action Counts has pulled together a coalition of mobile payment platforms hosted by the Green Digital Finance Alliance, so a Geneva-based NGO that will work with those mobile payment platforms in exploring how the Ant Forest experience can be translated into other aspects of nature and indeed other jurisdictions and ways in which behavioral responses at that kind of scale can be secured from both consumers and also citizens as pension policy holders. And if I can go right to the edge and perhaps give one further example of innovation that is not normally what many of us would think of as innovation, which is really in the regulatory space. Now, obviously, regulation we don't normally think of as part of the innovation lens, but of course it is. It isn't only market innovation we're interested in, it's policy and regulatory innovation. Now, anti-money laundering rules in principle do apply to environmental crimes, remembering that environmental crimes account for 80 to 90% of the deforestation, particularly in Latin America, somewhat less so when we look at Indonesia and other parts of Asia. And yet financial institutions are not liable for nature crimes unless the illicit financial flows pass across their balance sheets. So really, AML rules are intended not to deal with the crime itself, but to deal with the flow of associated illicit finance. So there's significant discussion now as to how to extend the application of AML to a point where, in effect, financial institutions would have to demonstrate not that there were no illicit financial flows crossing their balance sheet, but rather that there were actually no nature crimes in their financing value chain that they were either neglectfully or knowingly benefiting from in their legal financing arrangements. What do all of these different pieces show? They show that nature is moving from a worrying externality to the global economy to one that is going up the inflection point of the innovation cycle as we begin to see many, many different kinds of nature markets beginning to emerge. And of course, at that early point in the inflection, one expects, and we see in practice, innovation, but chaos. Lots of different approaches, largely ungoverned, under-regulated, not really understood, experimental, large-scale failure, replication, duplication, overlap, contestation, different actors, some acting with integrity, perhaps others less so. And this is, of course, normal at an early stage of market development for any topic, any place, anywhere, anytime. But here, of course, there is a particular risk and need to act more collectively in beginning to marshal and shape this new wave of innovation. Of course, the risk is that if the financialization of nature happens in the wrong way, then it will accelerate the degradation of nature, and markets will turn out to be predatory rather than generative of the nature positive outcomes that we actually need. So in January next year, Finance for Biodiversity will launch a task force on the future of nature markets, not to invent new markets, but rather to understand the landscape more broadly, bring together many of the different innovators and actors that are pushing forward new ideas, beginning to shape a narrative that can align with our broader interests to secure both private gain and public purpose outcomes, and necessarily beginning to think about the policy and broader regulatory and standards implications of this new phenomena. I think we need to embrace nature markets as they emerge. We need to encourage and indeed catalyze innovations across the entire waterfront of the different examples and other things that I haven't had a chance to mention. But we also need to, at the same time, not constrain it, but begin to understand this waterfront and to begin to marshal it to ensure that there are no undesirable, unintended consequences. Maybe with that, Barbara, I'll bring it to a close. If there are a couple of minutes for any questions or answers I can offer, I would be more than happy to listen in.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Simon. I think first applause. I think you brought a lot of the discussions that we have had also in the morning together, and I think we will be focusing after your speech also really how to finance nature-based solutions, but not yet. So keep Simon on still, please. We still have a Q&A session with Simon, not yet with Flinder. So I think what is really critical is that we can, yes, you're back. We can see you again. That's great, wonderful. I think what you were saying, about the financialization of nature assets, I think it's really important that you mentioned, and I think that was mentioned by André again and again this morning as well, that we need to have the right accounting systems, that we really account for nature correctly. I think we also have the nature-based solution standards by IUCN, which will also help to ensure there is a net positive impact. But I'd like to ask the participants either online or also here in the room if you have any questions to Simon and to his presentation. Yes, we have a question there in the back. Maybe, yes, Frank will bring you the microphone.
Hi, my name is Hosdel Jura. I'm from I4SD. It's a development group which is working on tribals and working with different groups in rural areas. And we have some biodiversity to protect. When do you think the initiative will come into full action where we could actually start looking for a grant or some financing to do in the work in the field?
So I'm not sure if this is a helpful answer, but let me give it a go. Last week I found myself on the phone with a banker who was in the carbon trading business. And he had just done a deal with a community organization in Mexico, effectively buying what I described earlier as a carbon offtake agreement, effectively linked to nature assets that were being stewarded by community organizations. This obviously provides a line of finance to that organization. However, what was also clear from my discussion with this banker was that the deal that had been struck was quite inappropriate. That they had done a deal where the carbon price equivalent was perhaps $3, $4, or $5 a ton, a fraction of what we expect carbon prices in voluntary carbon markets to be over the coming years. And in addition to that, the full risk was passed on to the sell side, so the community organization, in that it was their responsibility to ensure that the nature asset was secure and delivered the carbon sequestration potential that was embedded in the contract that they had signed. So what is, if you like, a very short and sharp moral of this story? The short and sharp moral is that going forward, in many instances, the problem may not be a lack of money. The problem may be a difficulty in negotiating the right deal. Yeah, and that what we really need to think about is not only the grant side, and I entirely accept your point that there are many instances where grants are relevant, but that we are going to see, I would predict, a tsunami of finance moving into so-called nature-based solutions. And the challenge is not simply the integrity of the carbon ton, which is what the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets has focused on in the past. The challenge is whether the counterparty, the owner and steward of the nature asset, the community organization, the private landowner, the local authority, the indigenous community, whether they have the tools and knowledge to be able to negotiate a reasonable outcome. The example I gave is an example of a predatory purchase. And I think at this early stage in the development of these markets, we're going to see many more of these purchases and huge problems as the sell side is left with the risk and the purchaser of the offset agreement is left with a very profitable, largely risk-free deal. And so right now, my message would be nature-based solutions offer a potential on the climate side and a real potential to support those that are stewarding nature assets. But to turn that into something that is fair and just will require a rapid move to ensure that predatory behavior in those markets no longer takes place.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have to look at the time and, well, maybe is it a short question? Just a quick short question. Okay.
Hi, Simon, thank you so much for your presentation. I guess follow on from what you've just been touching on, and as an ex-banker, and you talking about not having, unintended consequences, that in my mind is maybe like an infrastructural or regulatory policy thing to help herd, because the current system doesn't incentivize the right type of behaviors, right? So what in your mind is missing or is required in order to herd things in the right way?
Yeah, no, absolutely the right question. And I'm watching Barbara giving me the evil look, so I'll have to keep my answer reasonably short. So, I think that it is unreasonable or at least unrealistic to look to supply side sovereigns, the government of Indonesia, Brazil, and elsewhere, to rapidly establish a fully functioning regulatory environment that can prevent that kind of predatory behavior. So although that may be the long game, we should not, in a sense, excuse ourselves by pointing to them as having failed to put it in place. So we need a bridging mechanism for the next 2, 3, 4 years, which is really the shortest time period one can think of for those sorts of regulatory mechanisms to be put in place, even in the best governed, relatively small economies such as Costa Rica and elsewhere. And that needs to include full transparency of transactions and placed on a registry so that very quickly one begins to see the extent to which predatory deals are being done. We need grievance mechanisms in voluntary carbon markets that allow contestations to come to the surface, not go into secret arbitration. And actually what would work best is that we have voluntary carbon market owners, such as the Monetary Authority of Singapore and others that are establishing these carbon markets, demanding conditions of that kind in order for offtake agreements to be eligible for being traded on their platform. So effectively, market access being established to ensure that some of those arrangements are in place. I think this is all completely possible, but I think we have an urgency given, in a sense, the gold rush, the Wild West moment that we're experiencing in these markets going forward.
Yeah, so thank you again, Simon, for sharing your insight and also for setting the scene actually for the discussion this afternoon, because we will hear now different pitches on how to finance nature-based solutions, and they will include also how tech innovation, but also how traditional businesses or banks and financial institutes are dealing with it. So maybe we can see quickly the slide of the different solutions. Exactly, so the next one.